Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard Podcast. On today's episode, going to be discussing the top 15 coaches of all time as determined by the NBA in conjunction with the 75th anniversary of the NBA and their all NBA 75 team. But more specifically, Doc Rivers. Is he overrated and does he belong on this list? If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe for weekly content. Also, the podcasts are now up on Spotify, so you can listen to the full episode uninterrupted there. And if there's a spot you agree with, disagree with, either reach out to us on Twitter or in that comment section, and we'd love to discuss with you. First of all, I realize I'm a couple weeks late on this announcement, but we had the trade deadline and the All-Star break, so I'm going to address it now. In conjunction with the NBA releasing the 75 greatest players of all time, they also released a list of the top 15 coaches of all time. In no particular order here is the list. Red Auerbach, Larry Brown, Chuck Daly, Red Holzman, Phil Jackson, Casey Jones, Steve Kerr, Don Nelson, Greg Popovich, Jack Ramsey, Pat Riley, Doc Rivers, Jerry Sloan, Eric Spoelstra, Lenny Wilkens. Obviously, there's a handful of coaches on this list that I just wasn't around for, was barely around for. So I'm not really going to say whether or not a few of those belong. But there was one that I have been around for that I think at first glance, I didn't think belonged. That's Doc Rivers. I've just always thought he's been overrated as a coach, and I was surprised to see him here in the top 15 coaches of all time. When I actually sat down to make the case for him being overrated, though, I found that despite the fact that I think he's overrated, he might actually belong on this list. So to start here, there have only been 35 different coaches to win an NBA title. So is he in the 40th percentile among coaches who have won at least one title? Well, that sounds a little bit more reasonable when you frame it that way. I think that this list somewhat factored in off the court contributions and influence, but I want to speak strictly to a basketball perspective, whether that be strictly accolades or some sort of contribution, be it revolutionizing the way the game is played or the way it's treated, prepared for, overall basketball influence, stuff like that. It's also worth mentioning that Doc's off the court contributions beyond basketball cannot be understated. He's been nothing but a class act, a great role model, great leader throughout his entire career. But for the sake of this podcast, I want to keep it to just the on the court stuff. So why do I think that Doc Rivers is overrated? Why am I picking on Doc? Well, I think first we need to define some criteria, not necessarily something super scientific and specific in terms of numbers, but just some sort of baseline or qualifications that we think an all-time coach should have. First and foremost, your career accomplishments. That stands above all else. We see this all the time when we're comparing players all time. How many titles did you win? Above all else, did you get it done at the highest level? If you didn't win a ton of titles, what did you bring to the game? Did your ideas change the way basketball is played? Did you revolutionize the game in some way? Were you an innovator? If you didn't win a ton of titles or have a groundbreaking idea, then how many wins did you accumulate over your career? What was your win percentage? While you were a coach, what were you thought of as? Were you a visionary like Mike D'Antoni, known for a revolutionary system? Were you a brilliant tactician like Eric Spoelstra or Nick Nurse? Did you always come up with the right adjustment, draw up the right play? Were you a great motivator like Pat Riley, always knowing what button to hit to get the most out of your team? Or were you a great locker room leader, a guy who could deal with and mesh a lot of personalities and egos like Phil Jackson? Let's go through those four items for Doc, and let's see where he stacks up all time and with his contemporaries on the list and with a few of the coaches not on this list that might have been considered to be there. Chips-wise, Doc has won. This has been his claim to fame. And ever since he won the 2008 title, the media and the narrative surrounding him is just that he's one of the best coaches in the league. And I just don't think that's ever been the case. In Doc's defense, that does put him in rare company. As I mentioned, in the 75 years of the NBA, only 35 different coaches have won titles. Among the top 15 coaches who have won titles, let's get the obvious guys out of the way who Doc does not have a case against. Phil Jackson, Red Auerbach, Greg Popovich, Steve Kerr, Pat Riley. There's no chance that Doc has a case to be better than any of these guys. Casey Jones, Eric Spoelstra are guys with 2 titles, along with Red Holzman, who I really know nothing about. He He won 2 championships with the Knicks back in the 70s. And ironically, that's the last time the Knicks have won a title. Chuck Daly, also 2 championships with the Bad Boy Pistons. He also coached the Dream Team, so he has some claim to fame there. Don Nelson, Jerry Sloan, the only titleless guys on the list. The rest have at least one. Among the guys not on this top 15 list who won titles outside of the 50s, who would have a case over Doc, nothing against 50s basketball. It would just be hard for me to get really excited about winning titles in a league that had something like 12 teams. So we have Rudy Tomjanovich. He won 2 titles as the coach of the Hakeem Olajuwon Rockets. Tommy Heinsohn won 2 titles with the Celtics in the 70s. And then we have player coach Bill Russell, who won 2 titles. Dick Motta, Bill Fitch, 1 apiece. There's also Rick Carlisle here. In terms of degree of difficulty for the title, I think the 2008 title was one of the easiest championships in NBA history. That's Doc's claim to fame, as I mentioned, and this was when the narrative around him as a coach shifted, and that was when he started becoming considered one of the top coaches in the league. So let's go back in time to the mid-2000s, sort of like the Super Bowl halftime show just did, and the state of the league, it was just watered down. Post the Shaq Kobe era, the talent in the league was really spread out. All the best players were spread out on different teams. It's nothing like the league we have today. And to kind of emphasize that point, the last 2 title teams here were a 2006 Heat team led by a very young Dwayne Wade and the sort of old busted version of Shaq. This team is widely regarded as one of the worst title teams in NBA history. Then following that in 2007, the Cavs make the finals with a young LeBron and a Boobie Gibson led team. Those were the 2 headliners. So if that tells you anything about the state of the Eastern Conference and the league, yeah, it was pretty dire in terms of having really dominant teams. So in 2007, the Celtics are at the crossroads here. It seems like all signs are pointing to moving franchise cornerstone piece Paul Pierce. Pierce has been really good for the team, but he just hasn't accomplished much winning, and it's not amounted to much in his career. So it seems like it's time to hit the reset button here. But instead, Danny Ainge goes a different direction and pulls off a crazy draft night trade to get Ray Allen for the 5th pick, Delonte West and Wally Serviak. Later on that offseason, the Celtics would trade for Kevin Garnett in a controversial, at least for the Minnesota side. I may do a podcast on that at a later date. But the Celtics send Sebastian Telfair, Ryan Gomes, Al Jefferson, Theo Ratliff, Gerald Green, and 2 picks that become Johnny Flynn and Wayne Ellington. Worth noting that the Flynn pick could have become Steph Curry. Sorry to rub that in, Timberwolves fans. So overnight here, the Celtics have assembled the first modern era big 3, this current version of the super team that we have in the league today. This was really the startup of that movement in the league. So for their starting 5, they have an unproven second-year guard named Rajon Rondo, Ray Allen, Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, and a young Kendrick Perkins. On the bench, veteran big man P.J. Brown, playoff hero Leon Poe, veteran point guard Sam Cassell, the ultimate glue guy, 3-and-D savant James Posey, one of the best perimeter defenders in the history of the league, Tony Allen, and my personal favorite, Eddie House, the irrational confidence heat check guy. Just a really solid team, especially when you factor in the reigning Eastern Conference champions are a LeBron, Sasha Pavlovich, Drew Gooden, Larry Hughes, Zydrunas Ilgauskas-led team. So that season, the 2008 year, they go 66-16, claim the 1st seed in the East. So a really great regular season. All signs are pointing, towards a title run here. But in the first round, they hit a hiccup. They go 7 games with the 8th seeded Hawks, 7 games with the Cavs in the second round, 6 games with the Pistons, and 6 games with the Lakers in the finals. So let's go through each of these playoff matchups and kind of discuss what happened here. So the Hawks, when you look at their roster, it's a good team on paper. They were just super young. It was a Joe Johnson, Josh Smith, very young Al Horford, veteran point guard Mike Bibby-led group. Also throw in Marvin Williams into the starting lineup. A solid team, but the reality is they were 8 games below 500 in the regular season. And from a group that has 3 future Hall of Famers in their prime, it just shouldn't have been a contest here. Round 2, they're playing a 45-win Cavs team. basically the same team from the prior year in terms of the Cavs perspective, but they're adding 10 points a game from Delonte West and 8 points a game of production from Wally Serviak. And I know how great LeBron is, but again, when you have three future Hall of Famers in their prime and a young, likely fourth Hall of Famer in Rajon Rondo, this should have been no contest. It's basically LeBron is the only advantage for the Cavs versus a better backcourt, better front court, better bench for the Celtics. Next up, we have the Pistons, and that might sound like an impressive Eastern Conference Finals win. The Pistons were very good in the mid-2000s, but they're 4 years removed from that title. And while when they won the title, they weren't an old team, outside of guys like Tayshaun Prince and maybe Richard Hamilton, the rest of that core group was in their prime currently and had the best years of basketball behind them. By 2008, Rasheed Wallace is 33 years old. He's got 2 more years left in the league. If you don't count the year that he came back out of retirement to play with the Knicks, that Knicks stint, he was 2 years removed from playing. So if you count that, I guess he's got 3 years left in the league. Chauncey Billups is 31, so he's still a really solid player, obviously. But Ben Wallace is just off the team. He's in Chicago. And so there's really no reason that this Celtics group, who even if they played the 2004 version of the Pistons, I still think they have an advantage, at least talent-wise, on the roster than what that Pistons group had even in 2004. Now you're fast forwarding, that Pistons group is 4 years older, and they're missing one of the key players on the team. This should have been no contest. Last up in the championship, they're playing the Lakers. And I know this is the Kobe Gasol Lakers, and we all know how great that team was, but this isn't quite the Kobe Gasol Lakers that we're thinking of. They hadn't quite become the team that they would eventually become. And here's kind of why. There's no Andrew Bynum in the entire playoffs. Trevor Ariza isn't quite ready yet. He's not a big part of the rotation. So the Lakers starting 5 for the finals and throughout the playoffs is Derek Fisher, Kobe, Lamar Odom, Vladimir Radmanovic. That's a blast from the past there. And then Pau Gasol. You're also getting significant contributions off the bench from Sasha Vujacic, Jordan Farmar, and Luke Walton. Luke Walton is a key contributor for this Laker team. And when you look at the front line of just Kendrick Perkins and the physicality of even Kevin Garnett and the physicality of a young Kendrick Perkins, that's just a huge ask for Pau Gasol to kind of hold up with them when his running mate is Vladimir Radmanovic or maybe Lamar Odom, if you wanted to consider him a power forward for the sake of this argument. So we're basically back in that LeBron Cavs situation all over again, with Kobe as the lone advantage for his team. I guess you can give the Lakers an advantage in the backcourt. At this stage, you're likely taking Derek Fisher over Rajon Rondo, but that's debatable. But we'll just, for the sake of argument, we'll give the Lakers the advantage in the backcourt. But that still leaves huge advantages with the front court and the bench for the Celtics. So it's pretty underwhelming as far as a playoff run goes. Just in terms of the difficulty of their path, I know you can only play the team that's in front of you, but to struggle the way that they did in every series is just really underwhelming. And at the time, this was seen as the start of a dynasty, but in reality, this group would only make the finals one more time during Doc's tenure. And the 2010 team that made the finals, that's the last time that Doc's made the finals at all. In terms of playoff success, Doc isn't exactly the beacon of success that many treat him as. It's quite the opposite, in fact. Enough has been made about this point, but we have to bring it up when we're talking about Doc. No coach has blown more 3-1 leads in the playoffs than Doc Rivers. In defense of the first one, it was a 1-8 matchup when he was the coach in Orlando, so we can give him sort of a pass there. The second one is less defensible. It was a 2-3 matchup where, yes, they were the underdogs seeding-wise. It's not enough to explain what happened in that series. The Clippers just completely fell apart in Game 6. It was an all-time fourth-quarter collapse, a fourth quarter where James Harden of the Rockets did not play in the entire fourth quarter. And it was a 49-18 run to close out the last 15-ish minutes of the game. And for the Rockets, that run was led by Corey Brewer and Josh Smith, fresh off being cut by Detroit. So not great there. The last time he blew a 3-1 lead was in the bubble. Again, only a 2-3 matchup. They were the favorite here. I just don't think anyone would argue they didn't have a vastly superior team here. Going into the regular season, nobody was considering the Nuggets as a title contender. Quite the opposite for the Clippers. I think they were the prevailing favorite that going into that season. And just in terms of the duo, Jokic and Murray versus Kawhi and Paul George, at the time, Jokic hadn't quite become the MVP level player we see him as today. And this was really the coming out party for Jamal Murray. So to be squared up against Kawhi Leonard, fresh off a finals MVP, who's by some considered the best player in the league at this stage, and Paul George, who isn't that far removed from his All-NBA season where he got some MVP consideration, this series should have been a no contest. And only making it to the second round with this group is just really tough to defend. And particularly when you consider the fact that the very next season, Ty Lue takes over this team, very similar team, and takes them all the way to the conference finals and nearly to the finals. That's not even telling the full story. Ty Lue also loses Kawhi Leonard for the conference finals and 2 games of the conference semifinals. He still gives the Suns everything they wanted and went 2-0 versus the Jazz without their best player in Kawhi. Next category. Did you revolutionize basketball? Pretty safe to say that that's not what Doc Rivers is known for. Not to say he's a dinosaur when it comes to basketball. It's not as if he's running 2 big men out there like it's the 90s, but he's not exactly on the cutting edge either. He's not a guy known for going against the grain like Mike D'Antoni did in the mid-2000s with the Suns, or Phil Jackson with the triangle. Even from a player perspective, not even system-wise. When have we said, wow, Doc really unlocked X guy? He really saw something in that player that no one else did. Like Steve Kerr did, weaponizing Curry's shooting or just drafting Draymond. And while Kerr isn't the GM in Golden State, he did play a big role in that selection. Eric Spoelstra and the Heat as an organization are always finding diamonds in the rough. Popovich is a guy who has always found value late in the draft or found new uses for unconventional players like Boris Diaw. To a much lesser extent, Mike Budenholzer, seeing Giannis as a center. Under Jason Kidd, Giannis was asked to do way more playmaking like a point guard versus banging inside like a center. So credit to Mike Budenholzer for seeing how to use him that way. And particularly with the drafting and finding undrafted / underutilized guys, that's never solely on the coach, but they do have a large pull when it comes to roster decisions. And at the end of the day, finding ways to use the guys on your roster is completely at their discretion. I just want to mention another name on here as a guy who revolutionized the way the sport is kind of treated. That'd be Jack Ramsey. He was included in the top 15 list, and he's known for putting an emphasis on conditioning and training to keep guys healthy and in shape. That seems like a no-brainer today, but back in the early stage of the NBA, that was just not the case. Doc Rivers just isn't known as a guy who has a revolutionary system offensively or defensively. And Doc Rivers-led teams are never teams that are known as finding diamonds in the rough or getting guys off the top of the scrap heap. Doc Rivers just in general really hasn't done anything or much to really push the game forward or change the way we think about basketball. Next up, let's move on to just the overall wins and losses. So Doc Rivers has a 51% win percentage in the postseason and 59% in the regular season. He's currently 10th all time in regular season wins with 1,028 as of recording this, and 7th in playoff wins with 98. Casey Jones, as a comparison, for one of his contemporaries on this list, 68% win percentage in the regular season, 59 in the playoffs. Spoelstra, 59 for both. Red Holzman, 55% in the playoffs and 54% for the regular season. Chuck Daly, 59% regular season, 60 in the postseason. And those are all guys with 2 titles. In terms of the guys with just 1 title, he's middle of the pack in terms of overall wins, but in terms of overall win percentage, but the overall wins and the longevity is going to be what pushes him ahead of most guys in the top 15 or anybody that would be looking to take his spot. So among the guys who would be looking to take this next spot or Doc's spot in the top 15 of all time, with Fitch and Mata, win percentage wise, they're both sub 500 in the regular season, and Mata has a sub 500 playoff win percentage. Tough to move them ahead of Doc, especially with given that all those guys all have one title. In the case of Rudy and Tommy Heinsohn, while I mentioned they have more titles, they just didn't coach long enough to supplant Doc and didn't do enough in terms of legacy or innovation to the game to edge him out there. Carlisle is just a shade below Doc in both regular season and playoff win percentage and also overall wins. So on the list, we also have a couple of coaches who never won titles, and Don Nelson. He's the winningest coach in league history. He's got 300-ish more regular season wins than Doc. Jerry Sloan, fourth all-time, 200-ish more wins than Doc. Hard to imagine a list without either of those two on it. And this is the category that ultimately is what gets Doc into the top 15 is longevity, how long he coached, how many wins he's accumulated. But I do want to get to the last category because I think this is the biggest reason that Doc Rivers is overrated. So what is Doc Rivers known for as a coach? Every time somebody pitches him to me, every time he gets sold to me, it's on the basis of him being a great locker room kumbaya guy. That's the whole reason he was brought to Philly in the first place, to mend that Simmons-Embiid relationship and find a way to help them coexist. How did that work out in the end? Within a year, that situation had completely devolved and degraded, so much so that Ben Simmons outright refused to even show up at the team facility. Is that all on Doc? Well, no, it's not, but it was trending in the wrong direction prior to him getting there, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back, or in this case, the hay bale that broke the camel's back. His post-game comments after Game 7 last year, I think, is what pushed Simmons over the edge, saying that you're unsure of whether you can win a title or not with Ben Simmons at point guard. Even if that's true, that for Doc, that's just a strange comment. He's been around long enough to know better than to do that in public. That's something you do behind closed doors with the owner and the GM in terms of trying to get an offseason move made. In hindsight, they end up getting Harden for Simmons, so maybe it works out in the end, but that's still one stop where guys didn't get along and he didn't do a good job of managing personalities. So let's go one stop previous with the Clippers. Well, it's been well documented that the Lob City Clippers teams didn't get along very well. Chris, Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan, they all hated one another. Even the role guys really resented the blatant nepotism that Doc showed with Austin Rivers and that contract he gave him. So we're already up to two stops where that didn't work out. How about Boston? Well, it looks like the guys on the Boston team have kind of buried the hatchet, but until very recently, they all hated one another, and that's kind of how that ended. Ray Allen felt so underappreciated, in fact, that he took a pay cut to leave for a rival team in the Miami Heat just to come off the bench there. So that's three stops where he's done a terrible job keeping the peace. And that's literally what he's known for. No one is out here saying that Doc Rivers is a great tactician, great X and O guy. He's not known for making great in-game adjustments. So if he isn't keeping the peace, what is he doing for your team? And maybe you want to argue that Phil Jackson couldn't keep the peace with Kobe and Shaq, and that's what he was known for. That is true. But the main difference there is that group won 3 titles in a row. Doc Rivers has won 1, and it's not because his team couldn't realistically win a title talent-wise. He's had some very good teams and teams that have been title favorites going in. And in a lot of cases, they've ended in disappointment or just bowing out of the playoffs way earlier than they should have been. And I know I kind of ended up settling on Doc Rivers belonging among the top 15 coaches of all time. But the reason I still don't feel very good about this is because when the NBA does the top 100 anniversary or the 100-year anniversary and takes 20 coaches or something like that, Doc Rivers is still going to be there on this list. You never see guys removed from these lists. And we have coaches today who are better than Doc and who are likely going to be vying for a spot on this list. And then we're also going to have some guys that are either first or second year head coaches or haven't even gotten their break yet that might be left off of the list because Doc is on it. So let's create a fantasy draft type scenario here where we're in a fictional universe. We're starting the league over and we're drafting coaches. Also, all the coaches are the same age, so age is no factor here. And the goal is to win titles for the next 15 years or so. So the key is getting guys who are good at player development, good in-game adjusters, obviously good locker room coaches. Like you need somebody who's all encompassing, kind of like what you would expect from an all-time type coach. So where would Doc Rivers get taken in that draft with age being no factor? Because obviously him and Popovich are kind of on the back end of their careers and may not have as long as guys like Nick Nurse, Eric Spoelstra and company. So we'll just say that we're doing a 15-year league. Everyone's coaching the entire time, and there's no regression due to age. So is he among the top 5 current coaches in that scenario? I don't think he is. So right off the top, we've got Steve Kerr, Greg Popovich, Spoelstra. I don't think there's any case that Doc Rivers would get selected before any of those 3. I think you're likely taking Nick Nurse. I think you're likely taking Ty Lue above him, especially with the current Clippers situation. You know, they both have the same amount of titles, but what Ty Lue has done with this current Clippers group is remarkable. He's winning a lot of games and they don't have their best players. And he followed up the Doc Rivers performance with the Clippers with a much better performance with a very similar team. So already Doc Rivers is outside of the top 5. Now we're getting to some debatable guys here. I think most would take Quinn Snyder. I think most people would take Quinn Snyder over Doc. So already we're at Doc at 7. In terms of proven guys in the league, not necessarily the 1 to 2 year head coaches that we might take ahead of Doc in hindsight after we've seen more of them. But just in terms of proven guys we have in the league, next up, we've got Michael Malone, Mike Budenholzer, Frank Vogel, Monty Williams, Rick Carlisle. That's the territory we're in. I think those last guys I mentioned are toss-ups at worst. I think you would have to make a hell of a case to me to take Rick Carlisle over Doc Rivers. But worst case scenario, we're taking Doc Rivers 13th. Best case scenario, he's getting 7th among current coaches. And again, granted, there might be some up and coming guys that you might rather have than Doc coming down the line with hindsight. So it's just hard to include him in among the top 15 coaches of all time when he's not even a top 5 coach in the league currently. And just in conclusion here, Doc's claim to fame is that 2008 title. It's his biggest selling point, and it's one of the most underwhelming titles in NBA history. He hasn't brought any innovative changes to the league, and he's failed to keep the peace with the last 3 teams he's been with, and that's his strong suit as a coach. His only claim to the top 15 throne is his longevity and overall win totals. But as we move forward, that case isn't going to continue to hold water. He's a good coach. I don't want anyone listening to this to think that I don't believe he's a good coach. I don't want anyone thinking that I believe he's a bad coach. He shouldn't be the head coach for some team. He is a good coach. He's a quality coach, and he should be the head guy for somebody. He's just not an all-time great, despite him ending up on this top 15 coaches of all time list.